And so there's some things that we don't know, and we need to be honest about those. Or there's some areas where maybe scripture is unclear. We need to be honest about that. But where there's been so much of a focus on what they call fake news
Hmm.
in the media and that, we need to be careful that we're not also guilty of fake news.
Welcome to Calvary Conversations. My name is Tim Hange, and I am an English and Education faculty member at Calvary University. I have today with us our guest, Scott Edgar, for part two of a great conversation.
Yes.
The first focused on Scott's involvement in Christian leadership coaching, and the second now will focus on his role as an educator, but really on Christians in higher education as a whole. So, by way of refresher, you can see the full introduction in the first interview. But Scott Edgar is a graduate of Calvary University. He and his wife both they served in the former Soviet Union for several years as missionaries. He has a lot of experience in Christian higher education, serving as a faculty member, an academic dean, and as an associate dean. Currently, you are a doctoral mentor at Liberty University, and you are involved in other contracted roles with a number of other Christian
Yep.
universities. And you've also gone through the educational process yourself quite extensively, from a um, bachelor's at Calvary, an MDiv in Christian thought from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a DMin from Fuller Theological Seminary, a PhD from the University of Wales in applied theology, a graduate certificate in executive coaching.
Yep.
Uh, I'll add that in there because it's a really important part of your makeup
Yes.
too. So, Scott, welcome again. We appreciate you being willing to come
Oh,
back for
thanks,
part
Tim.
two of this
Really enjoy it.
conversation.
Mhm.
Um, so let's just dive right in. As a Christian professor, or I guess professor would be the best term to use, even though you wear a number of hats. What are some of the biggest challenges that you face in the world of education?
Oh, very good question. Of course, a lot of your colleagues there at Calvary, Tim, would highlight the need to stay current in your discipline.
Hmm.
So that's true if it's Old Testament or something in theology or biblical studies, or if it's in counseling or business. But uh, probably the greatest challenge and need, and indeed it's becoming really required almost, is to stay current in your field, and that includes some type of scholarship, publishing in journals.
Hmm.
It could include, speaking at academic conferences. And now there's a greater focus on some type of scholarship that benefits the broader community of Christ, or maybe even the community. And so a lot of people use, I think they call it the Boyer's model of scholarship, and they require some type of publication or involvement from faculty in scholarship in a variety of different levels, from the more heady
Hmm.
academic journals to something that benefits the community.
It does sound exhausting, but on the other hand, it is a bit refreshing, I think, to know that the institutions that you serve with take your scholarship seriously and your reputation as a scholar seriously.
Yeah, and it is a challenge because teaching itself takes a lot of time, but the scholarship piece, staying current in your field, is a
Hmm.
part of it. I would say a new piece of the puzzle now is staying current in new learning technologies.
Right.
And that is something that, previous generations of, teachers at Calvary or other schools didn't have.
Yeah.
But now staying current in online learning technologies, recording, doing podcasts like this.
Hmm.
I have a couple of universities where it's all done on mobile learning, and so I'm able to access my courses, interact with students, all on a mobile device.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
and so that is a challenge. Our kids, they were native. They were we call it technology natives. They do
Right.
this stuff in their sleep.
Right.
I'm an immigrant in that. So I grew up old school, with notes and a face-to-face classroom
Right.
and actually typing my papers.
Hmm.
And now here we are with these new technologies. So that's a challenge, I think, for Christian universities and for us as faculty, staying connected to our Christian mission
Right.
is very critical. Uh, Not just scholarship for scholarship's sake, but scholarship that benefits the Christian university and the church.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that's another challenge. And you teach English, you teach
Yes, I
writing.
do.
And I would say perhaps the greatest challenge today is staying fluent in the language of our students.
Right.
And so they speak differently, they have different terminology, they have a different worldview, and we need to stay current in knowing how to communicate biblical and Christian truth to them. Otherwise, we're just talking and we're no
Yes.
longer relevant. And so you could have all these other pieces that I've mentioned, but if we can't communicate with our students, the educational process is moot, isn't it?
It is. It is. And, the other side of that too is teaching our students to communicate within their modes using rhetoric that is, and when I say rhetoric, I mean persuasive speech, as, I'm using the classical positive use of the word
Hmm.
rhetoric,
Hmm.
using rhetoric that is appropriate, that is biblical, that treats the reader with respect, that demonstrates a well researched and a well thought out opinion, and that does it with an ethos of handling the data well and handling the reader well, or the listener well. So yeah, there's definitely, but I like what you're saying. It's about us learning from them as well about the milieu of their communicative style and approach, as well as what we want to teach them. That's really important. Well, you brought up the importance of staying true to the, I forget your exact terminology, but to the Christian worldview, or the biblical worldview.
Hmm. Hmm.
And Scott, as a graduate of Calvary, I do know that the biblical worldview is important to you. How do you approach infusing a biblical worldview into your teaching?
Oh wow, that's such a critical issue for our conversation because if we're truly doing Christian education, we can't just be parroting what we're receiving or what's out there in the secular world. I think it begins with us. We have to
Hmm.
be people who ground our lives, that ground our thoughts in our worldview. It needs to be renewed.
Yeah.
So that we have to have that foundation itself, and then as we approach our disciplines, then to look for those connections, look for those foundations that we can then pass on to our students. But I think it starts with our own personal spiritual formation,
Hmm.
making that a priority in our lives so that we're being taught by God throughout the week. And then we're just sharing these little lessons with our students. And so it begins there. Uh, you're probably familiar with, Sire's book, The Universe Next Door.
Yes, I am.
You know,
Yeah.
just, I just remember reading that. I think that came out when I was at Calvary, of all
Hmm.
things. And it was kind of out there at the time. They had questions like, well, what does it mean to be human? What is it? What is truth? And when I was going to school, uh, those were, uh, there was not a lot of debate on those, at least in our corners of the Christian university and the church. What does it mean to be human? Well, uh, right now, those are huge issues.
Right.
So, what they call biblical anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in school and at Calvary, it was eschatology and other issues. But now the debate is on more foundational matters of teaching.
Right.
What does it mean to be human?
Right.
So I think that's kind of a paradigm, a framework that we could use in our teaching. I also, when I teach in different areas, uh, students are very open to seeing what I call collision points,
Mm-hmm.
area where maybe counseling, uh, what's the accepted theory, and scripture disagrees, or where they complement, but there's some type of connection.
Right.
So building a foundation takes time, and
Yeah.
it's becoming more difficult because, frankly, there's a growing level of biblical illiteracy, even in our churches. And so I would imagine, Tim, at very strong Christian schools, more and more students lack maybe the foundation that they would have received in their churches 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, I agree. I
Yeah.
agree.
So there's plenty of work to be done, but we really want our students to think, live, and serve according to a biblical worldview. It's not
Yes.
just a cognitive thing, but it should permeate our daily life and how we function in the world, be it in the business world or in ministry.
You bring up such an interesting point about the fact that we cannot take foundational Christian ideas, such as what is a human being, uh, for granted when we are approaching students, because one of the greatest sins we can commit as a teacher, I believe, is assumption fallacy. To assume that a student already knows something that they do not know, and as such to hinder their learning. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to address these foundational issues in our classrooms because they're not being taught these issues from a biblical worldview in their schools or very often in their churches, who, again, if they're led by people from our generation, may be making assumptions about what
Yeah.
students automatically know and believe. So yeah, super important. Well, and maybe this is a good segue into this question: why do we need Christians in higher education? Uh, and I'd be curious to hear your view on this from both. Do we need Christians in both, secular education and Christian higher education? But maybe that's a little bit. Let's start with that first question. Why do we need Christians in higher ed?
Well, I think we're seeing in our society today, and there's been a number of flashpoints over the last several years, but be it for whoever thought that would have conversations on socialism or Marxism
Mm-hmm.
or some of these basic conversations on what it means to be human or gender. Those were seeds that were planted 20 to 30 years ago.
Yes.
And so seeds, even if the process is delayed, the most seeds normally germinate. And I think we're seeing in full view what education can do for good or for worse. And I think, and we've always believed this, but there's a critical need for us as believers to be engaged in preparing Christian young people
Mm-hmm.
to think, to live, and to serve according to a biblical worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as long as we have freedoms in this country, we need to have believers in public education who can present our truth in a winsome way in the marketplace of ideas. And
Yes.
that is just critical. And one approach is let's just completely retreat from that, or if we do something, we say something nasty on Facebook, or which is, another challenge, social media as an
Oh,
influence.
yeah.
But I really believe that we need to be out there and we need to engage all these isms from a biblical worldview, and not just hitting the hot buttons, but laying the foundation for the Christian and a biblical worldview. And I think of a movie that came out years ago called The Great Debaters. It had Denzel Washington in it, and he
Mm-hmm.
had a group of kids from, I think it was a historically African American school in the South. And the story goes that they ended up um, having a debate contest in Harvard, and they won.
Right.
And I think as Christians, we need to be more articulate and skilled in debating and presenting our case. And that's where it's going to go. Right now, our country, our world is not too civil. We have the
Yes.
council culture.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as believers, we need to get beyond just counseling them, and we need to engage and be articulate, and be people who know how to engage society in a
Right.
winsome way, just kind of like some of the early Christian thinkers and apologists of the early church.
Mm-hmm. I think angry rhetoric and combative rhetoric is often the fallback of the person who doesn't understand their position well and can't articulate it well. And it represents an internal fear, I think, if you really were to press people
Mm.
of, I have this worldview, but because I haven't put in um, my research or my academic time, I haven't put in the study. That would be a better way to say it. Study to show yourself approved unto God, right? As Paul exhorts Timothy. Um, they haven't put in the study, and so it's easier to lob bombs than it is to, as Paul did, be in the marketplace. Standing firmly on your position, yes, but respectfully persuading others to see the biblical worldview as something that is not only viable from a faith standpoint, but even intellectually viable. So, yeah, that's huge. Um, what are some of the biggest challenges facing Christian university students from an intellectual standpoint?
Mm.
Let's start with that one. Well, maybe we should I have two standpoints here. I'll throw them both out and then we can take them as they come. The biggest challenges facing Christian university students from an intellectual standpoint and a faith standpoint.
Wow. Intellectual standpoint, I think we've talked about some of the need to, whatever your discipline is, and if you're talking more broadly, we just need to build our faith and build our worldview on a solid foundation. And
Mm-hmm.
and so there's some things that we don't know, and we need to be honest about those. Or there's some areas where maybe scripture is unclear. We need to be honest about that. But where there's been so much of a focus on what they call fake news
Mm-hmm.
in the media, and that we need to be careful that we're not also guilty of fake news. And so I think as believers and as Christian students, we need to be people who articulate our view well. We're gracious. We know how to debate with integrity, but also I think we need to major on the major issues where there's a lot of clarity and hammer those down.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to resist the temptation to uh, be dogmatic in areas that are less clear, or maybe they're not relevant for the
Right.
day we live in. And so I guess it goes back to intellectual integrity,
Mm-hmm.
the ability to do critical thinking and to hear data. We're bombarded with data every day in the news, and to be able to sift through that to identify what is a valid case and what is not. And I've taught the topic or the discipline of critical thinking at a variety of schools. That seems to be a big thing these days. And I think that's an area where we could demonstrate that
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
pull back on the temptation to say something on Facebook that's inflammatory, and instead be people who articulate in a winsome way what the truth is.
And I think we can really be an example to the world right now because I see examples of this in and out of Christendom on either extreme of the political spectrum. Is we see this sort of uh, ethos of just say whatever you need to, no matter how inflammatory it is, no matter how effective it is. The focus isn't, is this effective to convince somebody of this opinion? It's more a matter of signaling, this is my tribe, and getting your tribe to clap for you.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really how hearts and minds are convinced. And I would argue that's not a mirror of Christ's behavior or of the apostles in the New Testament either. Yes, of course, there are times when the gospel does, by its very nature, offend. It tells us that what we do is not sufficient, and that's offensive to us. We want to be able to do something to earn the greatest gift that's been given to mankind, the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. But in the end, it is, on the one hand, it takes a certain kind of, as Paul talked about it, of foolishness to believe it. But on the other hand, uh, it is the most logical and
Mm-hmm.
natural conclusion intellectually that we could possibly reach. So yeah, it's tough getting our students to see that, especially when culture has conditioned them, I think right now more into a tribal mentality than
Mm-hmm.
than a mentality of thinking, than an ambassador mentality. Maybe that would
Exactly.
be a way to put it.
Yeah, you watch people who are good negotiators or good ambassadors throughout history. What was it, Kissinger or others? And there is an art of being articulate, of not being inflammatory, of being a person who mediates and can disagree even in a good way, so you don't alienate parties or enemies. And I think we need to resist the temptation to fall into some of the traps you're talking about, Tim, of almost sanctified trash talking.
Right.
and
Right.
and it's instead, what does Scripture say? The truth and love.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and if society just sees us as just angry, bitter, and hateful, uh, that's not going to win the day for Christ.
I think Daniel is an incredible example of this out of Scripture. We see somebody who was highly educated in a secular system, and even prior to that, probably in his system as well. He was obviously seen by the Babylonians as bright to begin with. But you have somebody who was, depending on which king he was under, the second or third tier of
Yeah.
command in Babylon, one of the most wicked empires that ever existed. And yet somehow he managed to maintain his Christian integrity and his belief while living in a highly secular culture. And I think we can take a lot of lessons from
Mhm.
an examination of his life. I think we need to really be hearing the words of Peter when he says that to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, but to do so with gentleness and respect. There's this aspect of readiness, which takes a lot of intellectual commitment and discipline. And there's an aspect of our heart and our approach to people, gentleness and respect, even when we're being mistreated. So, yeah, there is a lot to consider.
That's a great example there, Tim. We tend to focus on Daniel's boldness
Mhm.
and his ability to lay it on the line for what he believes. But the other side of Daniel is he was probably very shrewd, very wise. He didn't always lay all his cards on the deck.
Mhm.
And so there's probably a lot of times where, he could have said something, he could have made a stand, but obviously he was very wise in the battles he chose.
Right.
And
Right.
so uh, there's probably a shrewdness there, a little bit of stealth that he demonstrated in his dealings,
Hmm.
as compared to drawing the line on every issue, because I'm sure there were plenty,
Right.
So
Yeah. And I think what you said earlier, that ties well into what you said earlier about it's not only critical thinking isn't just about thinking through an issue as logically as you can, but it's also about prioritizing the higher order concerns and the lower order concerns. And I think as Christians right now, we really need to be giving a lot of priority to the higher order concerns. And that's where our culture is at. We're no longer in a position where we're fine tuning the beliefs of a Christian worldview that largely permeates culture. That ship has sailed.
Yeah.
We are in a truly post-Christian environment, and we need to keep the main things the main things. So,
Right. That's a very good point, Tim. 20, 30 years ago, when we were living in a little bit more of a Christian culture,
mhm.
a lot of areas we're doing the fine buffing, we're doing the polishing. Uh, Boy, now we're doing foundational work. We're doing brick and mortar things.
Right.
And we probably need to make that a priority in what the church does, and what we do in Christian higher ed is uh, polishing the brass. That's a wonderful thing, but we're doing foundational work
Yep.
with
Yep.
students today.
Yep. Well, that's a great place for us to close our conversation on the idea of foundational work. And we invite our listeners, and whether you're a student or whether you're a Christian leader of some sort, and you are always in leadership, if you are a believer, you have a sphere of influence, we invite you to really take that seriously and to love the Lord deeply with your mind and your heart and soul and strength, but your mind also. Well, thank you so much, Scott. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we thank you, our listeners, for listening. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.